There is a document that should not exist. Not because it was suppressed, not because it was forged, but because the language inside it belongs to no category that the official record permits. It was filed in 1691, somewhere between a trade ledger and a diplomatic correspondence, in the kind of archive that survives not because anyone protected it, but because no one bothered to burn it. And in that document, inside a notation that should have been bureaucratic and empty, someone described the primary instrument of the Tartarian sovereign in terms that have no place in any record of any empire. They did not describe its weight. They did not describe its material value. They did not list its jewels or its provenance or its lineage of ownership. They described its conditions. Object required distance from excessive moisture. It required distance from crude iron. It required distance from untrained hands, not unwashed hands, not unworthy hands, but untrained ones. And it required, above all, a specific kind of stillness in the room where it was held, not silence, stillness. The distinction matters because whoever wrote that notation understood that what they were describing was not passive. It was not a crown waiting to be worn. It was a system waiting to be operated. That one document changes everything that comes after it. Because the moment you accept that someone in 1691 described a piece of royal regalia using the language of operating conditions rather than symbolic value, you cannot go back to the comfortable version. You cannot read the Tartarian collapse as a simple story of conquest and succession. You have to ask a harder question, not what happened to the crown, but what was it doing in the first place? The comfortable version of Tartary is the one most people encounter, if they encounter it at all. A vast, vaguely defined territory, a name applied by European cartographers to lands they did not understand and could not fully map. A catch-all for the enormous interior of Asia, its peoples, its kingdoms, its nomadic confederations, squeezed into a single label because the complexity underneath was inconvenient. Under this reading, Tartary is not an empire at all. It is a cartographic error, a geographical dumping ground. A name that meant nothing specific because it was never meant to be precise. That version is clean, it is easy, and it has one persistent problem. It does not explain the object. Cartographic errors do not produce diplomatic inventories that describe their central instruments in terms of compatibility, containment, and technical precaution. Geographical misconceptions do not generate the kind of succession crises that followed the disappearance of the Tartarian crown, the kind of crises that look, from a distance, less like disputes over territory and more like panicked attempts to locate a missing component. Vague, misunderstood empires do not leave behind a pattern of ruins, rituals, architectural decisions, and genealogical obsessions that only make sense if something real was being protected, preserved, and whenever possible, quietly searched for. The people who simplified Tartary needed it to be simple, because the alternative required them to explain the object, and the object did not simplify. Start with what the sources actually say, not the popular summaries, not the secondary interpretations, the fragments that survived the editing. The crown of the supreme Tartarian sovereign appears in several independent records across a span of roughly 2 centuries, and the consistent feature of those records is not the description of its beauty, it is the description of its behavior. One chronicle written in a language that suggests a Central Asian court of the early 16th century describes the coronation not as a ceremony of conferral, but as a ceremony of assessment. The crown did not simply rest on the head of the new sovereign, it was held above, it was maintained at a distance. And the attendants, not servants, not priests, but what the text calls something closer to technicians, watched. They watched the sovereign's breathing. They watched the response of his eyes to the proximity of the object. They watched the surface of his skin and the steadiness of his hands, and only after a period of observation that the chronicle measures in intervals rather than minutes did the process of actual contact begin. If that were the only record, it could be dismissed as ritual theatre. Mystical pageantry elevated by later transcription into something that sounds more precise than it was. But it is not the only record. A second source from a different tradition describes the same ceremony using completely different imagery and arrives at exactly the same structure. Distance first, observation second, gradual approach third, and a final stage the text describes not as crowning but as seating, as if the crown and the sovereign had to find each other's correct position before the connection could be established. A third source, the most discomforting of all, mentions, almost in passing, that in cases where the assessment did not proceed correctly, the ceremony was stopped. Not postponed, stopped, the sovereign was withdrawn, the object was returned to its holding conditions. And the court entered what the record calls a period of suspension, during which no decisions of weight were made, no alliances were formalized, and no public appearances by the sovereign were scheduled. A failed coronation, not a failed ceremony, a failed connection, and the entire machinery of the empire paused until the problem could be diagnosed. That is not theatre, that is a system responding to a fault condition. Now hold that image and consider what the crown was supposedly made of. Gold, according to most later descriptions, set with precious stones, crafted with exceptional skill, worthy of the supreme ruler of a vast territory. But the older sources, the ones that predate the simplification, tell a different story about the material. They mention, consistently, an alloy, not pure gold, an alloy whose composition is described with unusual specificity in some texts and unusual vagueness in others, as if different scribes had different levels of clearance to describe it. The consistent thread is that the alloy was not chosen for beauty. It was chosen for what one text calls responsiveness. Another uses a term that translates most accurately as conductivity, not in the modern electrical sense, but in the sense of something that carries, transfers, and mediates. The prohibition on crude iron is significant here. Iron disrupts. In the language of early metallurgy, iron was associated with interference, with the cancellation of subtle properties in other metals. Blacksmiths were kept from sacred sites in numerous ancient traditions, and the explanations always defaulted to ritual purity, to spiritual contamination. But what if those explanations were the simplified version? What if the original prohibition was technical? What if crude iron genuinely interfered with something the crown's alloy was designed to do? The prohibition on moisture is equally specific, not water moisture, sudden humidity, the kind of atmospheric change that affects conductivity in certain materials, the kind of change that, in a device designed to operate through subtle field effects, could corrupt the signal. These are not the storage conditions of a piece of jewelry. These are the storage conditions of an instrument. And here is where the question of what the crown actually did becomes unavoidable. The records that survive the coronation ceremony do not describe the sovereign who wore the crown as more powerful in the conventional sense. They do not describe him as more imposing, more frightening, more militarily capable. They describe him as more perceptive. The specific language varies, but the pattern is identical across sources. After a successful coronation, the sovereign could sense things, not in the supernatural sense that later chroniclers would invoke when they didn't know what else to do with the descriptions, in a practical, almost reportable sense. He knew when weather was about to shift before there were visible signs. He made decisions about troop movements that his generals could not explain and rarely needed to, because the decisions were consistently right. He chose routes through terrain that local guides had avoided for generations, and the routes turned out to be passable. He predicted droughts accurately in regions he had never visited. He ordered the opening of canals and the redirection of irrigation systems in ways that confused his engineers at the time and were vindicated by outcomes years later. This is not the portrait of a man touched by divine blessing. It is the portrait of someone operating with better data. The crown, under this reading, was not a symbol of authority over people. It was an instrument of access to patterns, to the kind of large-scale distributed information that an empire the size of Tartary would need to govern effectively. Atmospheric patterns, geographic patterns, the slow, continuous signals embedded in terrain, climate, and geological structure that no single human mind could process, but that a properly calibrated interface might translate into something usable. The sovereign did not become a god when he wore the crown. He became a sensor, a reader, the living component in a network that was much larger than any one person, and much older than any one dynasty. Now consider the collapse. When the Tartarian imperial structure began to fragment, and the dating of this fragmentation is itself contested, which is part of the problem, the crown did not fall in the way that valuable objects fall. It did not get captured. It did not get displayed as a trophy. It did not get melted down and redistributed. It did not end up in any of the places where conquered treasures reliably end up. What happened to it was something far more deliberate and far more strange. It was disassembled. The evidence for this is scattered, indirect, and easy to dismiss individually, but the pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. In the final period of Central Tartarian authority, the records that reference the crown shift their language. They stop describing it as a unified object. They begin, quietly, without explanation, describing components, an inner ring, a frontal element. What one text calls lateral conductors, using a term that has no precedent in any description of any royal regalia before or after. A device being described in parts is a device being taken apart. And then there is the account of the last known transfer. It does not describe a royal procession. It does not describe a military escort. It describes small groups, moving at different times, each carrying a package of no apparent value. The transfer was structured to ensure that no single group carried enough to constitute the whole, and that no single interception could recover the complete object. This is not how you protect a treasure. This is how you protect a secret, by ensuring that no one, not even the enemy who might capture all of your couriers, can reconstruct what was moved. Someone, in the final hours of Tartarian central authority, made the decision that the crown could not be allowed to fall into the wrong hands assembled. Whatever it did, whatever it accessed, whatever it connected, that capability could not be surrendered intact. So they broke it, deliberately, carefully, and they scattered the pieces. The question that follows is obvious, and its answer is what reshapes the entire subsequent history of Eurasian power. Where did the pieces go? Not into vaults, not into conquest trophies, not into the official record of any victorious power. They went somewhere quieter, more durable, and more protected than any of those places. They went into the royal collections of European dynasties. This sounds like a conspiracy theory until you start looking at the inventories. Not the public inventories, the ones compiled for display and prestige and the management of reputation. The private inventories, the restricted lists, the categories that appear in certain court records under headings that are neutral to the point of suspicion. Items of ancient origin, objects of undetermined provenance, pieces of prior right. These categories exist in too many royal archives, in too many separate kingdoms, to be explained as independent eccentricities. And what they contain, when they can be traced, shares characteristics that have no obvious explanation in the world of jewelry and regalia. Restrictions on cleaning agents, restrictions on proximity to certain metals, storage conditions that specify not just security, but environment, humidity, temperature, the presence or absence of certain materials in the surrounding room. Objects described as belonging to their holding conditions rather than to their nominal owners, as if the inventory compiler understood that the piece had its own requirements and the dynasty's role was simply to maintain them. And shapes, the shapes are wrong for their stated purposes, rings that curve in directions inconsistent with their alleged function, stones mounted in settings whose geometry serves no decorative logic, arcs and apertures whose dimensions match each other across objects separated by hundreds of miles and supposedly unrelated lines of collection. Separate, they are eccentric heirlooms. Together, they begin to look like a disassembled machine whose parts were deliberately distributed across the continent, hidden inside the most secure institutional structures that existed, royal collections, and kept alive under the cover of dynastic sentiment and sacred tradition. This is the moment when the history of European royal blood changes meaning entirely. The obsession with lineage that defined European aristocracy for centuries has always had an official explanation and an obvious critique. Official, bloodlines preserved legitimate authority, dynastic right, the will of God made manifest in heredity. Critique, it was self-serving mythology deployed by a class that needed to justify its dominance. Both of these are true, neither of them is the complete story. Because if the fragments of the Tartarian crown required a specific kind of biological interface to operate, and the evidence from the coronation protocols suggests strongly that they did, then the preservation of certain bloodlines was not mythology, it was maintenance. Think about what the coronation ceremony actually measured. It measured compatibility, the sovereign's breathing, pulse, skin response, pupillary reaction to the proximity of the object. These are not spiritual assessments. These are biological assessments. The crown was checking something about the person who would wear it, something heritable, something that could be preserved across generations if the right pairings were maintained, and something that could be diluted or lost entirely if the pairings went wrong. This reframes the most destructive habit of European noble culture, the insistence on marrying within a narrowly defined circle, even when the biological costs were becoming catastrophically visible. Hemophilia, mental instability, physical fragility. Generation after generation of courts watching their bloodlines become simultaneously more exclusive and more compromised, and continuing anyway. The conventional explanation is pride and politics, and those were real factors. But there may have been another factor operating beneath the political logic, one that the participants could feel but not name, one that had survived the loss of its original technical vocabulary and been translated, badly, partially, dangerously, into the language of divine right and sacred lineage. What if the imperative to marry within the bloodline was not just about keeping titles and territories consolidated? What if it was about maintaining a biological signature? A heritable pattern, something in the nervous system, something in the sensory architecture, something that expressed itself in rare individuals as an unusual sensitivity to electromagnetic fields, atmospheric pressure, geological activity, that the original Tartarian selection process had identified and preserved over centuries, and that the fragments of the crown were still in their dispersed and silent state, waiting to recognize. Under this reading, the inbreeding was not vanity. It was a failed attempt to maintain the compatibility key. It was a centuries-long breeding program, operating without understanding its own purpose, run by people who knew they had to preserve something, but had lost the technical language that would have told them exactly what, and exactly how. The results were what you would expect from a program, running on incomplete instructions. Now look at the buildings. The palaces of European dynasties are routinely explained as expressions of power. The bigger the building, the more impressive the ruler, the more secure the dynasty's claim to authority. That explanation covers most of the cases adequately, but there is a subset of royal construction, specific rooms, specific proportions, specific orientations, that it does not adequately cover. Certain coronation chambers were not positioned at the most visible or defensible point in their buildings. They were positioned at specific geometric coordinates. The placement makes no sense if the only purpose was ceremonial display. It makes precise sense if the space needed to be acoustically stable, electromagnetically neutral, or oriented to specific external reference points with a degree of precision that exceeds any decorative requirement. Certain private chapels in certain royal residences are oriented not to conventional liturgical directions, but to astronomical alignments, solstice risings, specific star positions that have no official explanation in the religious tradition those chapels supposedly serve. The standard reading calls this folk astronomy absorbed into Christian practice, but the precision is too high for folk astronomy. The angular measurements are in some cases accurate to within tolerances that would require instruments and methods not acknowledged in the official technical history of those periods. Certain palaces contain chambers whose proportions, height, width, depth, match each other across structures built in different countries, different centuries, by different architects with no documented connection. The probability of this being coincidental decreases the more examples you find, and there are enough examples now that coincidence is not a comfortable explanation. The most unsettling category is the rooms that were used to store the restricted objects. In several royal inventories, these rooms are described not just by their security features but by their physical characteristics: stone composition, ceiling height, distance from underground water, orientation of the primary access point. The object's storage conditions were matched to a specific built environment, as if the fragment needed not just security but resonance, a spatial relationship to the surrounding structure that kept it stable and perhaps partially active. Buildings built to house components of a machine that had been disassembled are still in some functional sense part of that machine. They are the chassis. The fragments inside them are the dormant circuitry. And the dynasties that maintained them were doing, without knowing it, exactly what the last Tartarian administrators had asked them to do: keep the pieces intact, keep them separate, keep them in conditions that would allow them to survive until something changed. What changed, several times across European dynastic history, was that someone tried to reassemble it. The evidence for this is the most indirect of all, and it is also the most disturbing, because the evidence is not documentary, or not primarily. The evidence is in the pattern of consequences that surrounded certain moments of dynastic consolidation. Moments when previously separate royal houses were united through marriage. Moments when specific objects were moved from their storage locations and brought together, briefly, before being returned or dispersed again. Moments when new coronation protocols were instituted that echoed, in distorted form, the technical procedures described in the old Tartarian records. Around these moments, the historical record shows a consistent cluster of anomalies. Mental collapse in otherwise capable rulers, not ordinary instability, sudden, catastrophic breaks that occurred specifically after major ceremonial events and were described by contemporaries with an uneasiness that the official record later softened into medical language. Fever, nervous exhaustion, a sensitivity to light and sound and pressure that rendered the affected person unable to govern. In several cases, a complete withdrawal from public life that was explained at the time as illness, and that, reading the private correspondence, sounds more like an overloaded system trying to reset. Atmospheric events. This is the category most easily dismissed and also the most consistently documented. Unusual storms following coronations, unseasonable frosts during succession crises, electrical phenomena in specific rooms that were reported privately and suppressed publicly, lightning behavior around certain structures that local people noted and that official historians filed under superstition. In at least 2 documented cases, witnesses described a sustained low-frequency sound, not heard exactly, but felt emanating from a coronation chamber during a ceremony of particular dynastic significance. If the crown fragments were still partially functional, if they retained some of the properties that made the original object what it was, then bringing them into proximity with each other, even without full assembly, would produce something, not the full effect, not the clean, calibrated operation of a properly maintained system with a compatible operator, something messier, interference patterns. The system recognizing that its components were near each other and attempting to synchronize without the key elements necessary to do so stably. The human beings inside that process would feel it, and if they were not the right human beings, not the right biological signature, not the product of enough generations of careful preservation, they would feel it as damage. This is the part of the story that the official record found most necessary to convert. Technical failure is not a narrative that serves power. A ruler who collapsed because he was biologically incompatible with the instrument of his own authority is a ruler whose authority is, at best, provisional and at worst illegitimate. That story cannot be told publicly, so it was translated. Biological incompatibility became divine judgment. The crown's rejection of an unworthy operator became God's rejection of a sinful king. Mental collapse from electromagnetic overload became moral degeneracy. The search for a compatible bloodline became the assertion of sacred right. The technical problem of maintaining a heritable biological signature across generations became the theological doctrine of royal blood. Every element of the original system survived this translation, but all of them survived in a form that stripped them of their explanatory power and replaced technical precision with spiritual metaphor. The metaphor was close enough to the original to preserve the behavior. Dynasties continued to guard bloodlines, protect objects, maintain buildings, and repeat rituals, but far enough from it to ensure that no one performing these behaviors understood why they worked, or what they were really doing. This is how a technology becomes a religion, not through cynical manipulation, necessarily, but through the gradual loss of vocabulary. When you can no longer say this material conducts in a way that interfaces with specific human nervous system architecture, you say this metal is sacred. When you can no longer say this candidate's biological profile is incompatible with the instrument, you say God has not blessed this king. When you can no longer say the fragments must be maintained in specific electromagnetic conditions, you say the relic demands reverence and stillness and separation from the profane. The behavior is identical, the understanding is gone. And a system operating on the behavior of a technology without the understanding of that technology will, reliably and slowly, fail. The failure was never total. That is perhaps the strangest thing. Across the centuries of European dynastic history, between the catastrophic collapses and the visible deteriorations, there are moments, individual rulers, specific decades that look anomalous, periods of unusual clarity, decision-making that seems to exceed the available information, governance choices that later generations describe as almost unnaturally effective. Rulers who seem to know things they should not have been able to know, who acted on information that no intelligence network could have provided, whose timing was too consistently right to be entirely attributed to political skill. These moments cluster around specific conditions. They tend to occur in dynasties that had maintained the most careful stewardship of their restricted collections. They tend to occur after marriages that, from a purely political perspective, seem puzzling, unions that brought no obvious territorial or military advantage, that sacrificed visible power for something that contemporaries could not articulate clearly. They tend to occur in reigns where the architectural record shows unusual attention to the buildings that housed the restricted objects, as if the sovereign instinctively understood that the storage conditions mattered. Partial function is still function. If only some of the fragments were in good condition, if only some of the biological compatibility had been preserved, if the building was close enough to right and the operator was close enough to compatible, the system might work incompletely, intermittently, but work, producing not the full perceptual expansion of the original Tartarian coronation, but something residual. A slightly better capacity for pattern recognition. A marginally enhanced sensitivity to large-scale environmental shifts, enough to make a difference in governance, not enough to reconstruct the original. And always, following those periods of apparent partial function, there would be the price. The successor who couldn't sustain it, the next generation where the biological drift had gone too far, the object moved or damaged, or the building modified in ways that disrupted the conditions that had made the partial function possible, the brief clarity replaced by the long return of noise. So the empire fell, the machine was disassembled, the pieces were distributed, the bloodlines were managed without full understanding of why. The buildings were maintained without knowledge of their original purpose. The rituals were performed without access to their technical meaning. And the whole system ran, at declining efficiency, for centuries, until the political and social upheavals of the modern era scattered the dynasties, dispersed the collections, and converted the buildings into museums and hotels and government offices whose curators know precisely nothing about what they are housing. Is the machine fully dead? That question sounds dramatic, but it is actually quite precise. The fragments are almost certainly still in existence. Objects of the type described in the restricted inventories are not easy to destroy. The alloys used in their construction were selected partly for durability. Some of them have probably been re-identified, remounted, reclassified. The stone that was once a frontal element of the primary instrument of the Tartarian Empire may now be catalogued as a decorative element of a 17th century European royal necklace. The inner ring may be described as a liturgical item of uncertain origin. The lateral conductors may be listed as ornamental attachments whose function is unknown. The biological compatibility, the heritable signature that the original system required, is harder to assess. Centuries of dilution, and centuries of the specific kind of inbreeding that damages rather than preserves, have probably distributed whatever the original pattern was across a very large population in very small concentrations. Not lost perhaps, but fragmented, just as the object is fragmented. And not, in any individual currently alive, likely to be concentrated enough to matter. The buildings are mostly still standing, mostly in recognizable relationship to their original proportions, mostly still oriented as they were originally built. Whether the environmental conditions they were designed to maintain still hold inside their walls, given the modifications of centuries of subsequent use, is impossible to say without measurement. So the machine may be dormant rather than dead. The pieces may be findable. The location can be reasoned toward, even if it cannot be confirmed. And the question of compatibility, of whether anyone currently alive carries enough of the original biological signature to interface with a partially reassembled system, is at least theoretically answerable. This is where the history stops being history and starts being something else. Not prediction, not conspiracy, something closer to an open file. The last thing that needs to be said is about the silence itself. The story of the Tartarian crown is not a story that was suppressed by a single actor for a single reason. It was suppressed gradually, collectively, and mostly without full understanding of what was being suppressed. Each generation that converted technical language into ritual language, that reclassified an operating condition as a sacred prohibition, that filed a fragment under item of ancient origin rather than component of unknown device, each of those generations was not lying. They were translating. They were doing what people do when they inherit a system they cannot fully explain. They keep the behaviors and change the vocabulary until the vocabulary no longer preserves the behavior's meaning. The result is a world that is full of residue from a technology it no longer recognizes as such. The coronation rituals of contemporary nations still echo, faintly, the assessment protocols of the Tartarian ceremony. The restrictions around certain royal objects still maintain, without anyone knowing why, the conditions that the objects require. The buildings still stand in their calculated proportions. The genealogies still record, buried in their complications, the routes by which the biological signature was passed forward. And if you know what to look for, if you have enough of the fragments of the original vocabulary to start reading the residue, the map begins to reassemble itself. Not toward restoration. The world that produced the original machine is gone. The governance structure it served, the understanding of nature and consciousness and territory that made it legible, the civilization that knew how to maintain the interface between human perception and planetary pattern, all of that is gone, replaced by something that is in many ways more powerful, and in this one very specific way more blind. But toward understanding. Because the question the Tartarian crown poses is not a historical question. It is not asking what happened in the steppes of Central Asia several centuries ago, or where a piece of metal ended up, or which dynasty carried which fragment across which border in what year. It is asking something much larger and much more uncomfortable. It is asking whether the relationship between human consciousness and the physical world is more reciprocal, more structured, and more technically accessible than the dominant scientific tradition of the last 3 centuries has permitted itself to consider. It is asking whether there was once a civilization that understood this relationship well enough to build instruments that operated within it. It is asking whether the loss of that understanding was accidental or managed, or whether it is even, in the strictest sense, a loss, or whether it is more like a long dormancy, with the pieces still in place, waiting for a vocabulary sufficient to name what they are. The crown was not gold. It was not a symbol, it was not a treasure. It was not a piece of religious theatre elevated to political significance by the pageantry of power. It was a machine. It was a specifically designed, carefully maintained, biologically interfaced machine that gave its operator access to patterns of information embedded in the physical world at scales too large for any unaided human mind to process. It was the primary instrument of a civilization whose understanding of the relationship between consciousness, terrain, atmosphere, and governance was sophisticated enough to build technology that modern science does not have a framework to classify. And when it disappeared, not destroyed, but disassembled and scattered with deliberate care, everything that came after was, in one very specific way, quieter. Not quieter in the sense of peace, quieter in the sense of reduced bandwidth, quieter in the sense of a system operating without its primary interface, managing on partial signals and degraded protocols, generating noise where there had once been clarity. The dynasties felt it, the buildings held it, the bloodlines carried traces of it, the rituals remembered its shape without preserving its function. And the world that came after, the world we live in, is built on top of that quietness, on top of the ruins of a connection that was deliberately interrupted, in a moment of emergency, by people who understood just enough of what they were breaking to know that it could not be allowed to fall whole into the wrong hands. They succeeded, the machine has not been reassembled. But the pieces are still there. And the question they are still asking, patiently, in the language of storage conditions and restricted inventories and buildings, with proportions no one can quite explain, is whether anyone left alive is still capable of reading the answer.